Hi, welcome to Chapter 16. This is Miss Nikki. We're going to discuss the endocrine system. If you remember, the endocrine system is one of your 11 organ systems that we discussed back in Chapter 1. And the reason I chose this slide to start off with is we've actually heard about some of these hormones before. We just didn't know we were really talking about the endocrine system. So this group of cells right here, these are parafollicular. And we'll talk more about what that means when we get to the thyroid. But these are parafollicular cells, and they produce a hormone called calcitonin. If you remember calcitonin from chapter 6, it tones down your calcium levels. And then remember we had the antagonist, which was parathyroid hormone. If your calcium levels are too low, then you release parathyroid hormone. That's released from a different gland. But I just wanted to drive home the point that we've already talked about hormones, whether we call them specifically hormones from the endocrine system. This cell right here is going to help us produce T3 and T4. These are thyroid hormones. Again, you've probably heard somebody say, I have a high metabolism or I have a low metabolism. This is what they're talking about, the amount of T3 and T4 hormones that are produced from their thyroid gland. So let's continue on with endocrine and take it one slide at a time. This slide is giving us an overview of the endocrine system. So basically, what does the endocrine system do? The hormones, which we'll talk about in just a second, but the hormones are going to influence metabolic activities within the body. So when we say metabolic, you should think of anytime anything's broken down or built up. You might be familiar with the terms catabolism or anabolism. Basically, if we break down glucose to make ATP, that's a metabolic activity. Remember also that hormones are transported in the blood. It was on the very first slide, the very first bullet, right? So these hormones act as chemical messengers. We've seen chemical messengers before when we took first anatomy and we talked about muscle action. So hopefully you remember the nervous system. What did the nervous system do? You released neurotransmitters. Examples would be acetylcholine, norepinephrine. So think about muscle action. And we talked about how neuron transmission was really quick, right? If you had one neuron and that neuron was going to release a neurotransmitter and it was going to be picked up by a second neuron, that happened within like 0.22 milliseconds. The time of the presynaptic to release the neurotransmitter, to cross the synaptic cleft, and for the second or post-synaptic neuron to pick up the signal, and then that caused the firing of the second neuron, and it released its neurotransmitter, and so forth and so on. But what we should get is that this is a very quick action. Also that it degrades pretty quickly. So we don't have neurotransmitters floating around forever. They release quickly and then they're broken down quickly by enzymes. Maybe you remember acetylcholine esterase. Anyway, what is different about hormones, they're also chemical messengers, but they occur more slowly and they tend to last longer than those of the nervous system. So if you want to think of nervous system as quick, fast acting, and you want to think of hormones as slow release and long lasting, that's probably a good start for endocrine. So what are the targets for hormones? They're going to target different cells within the body. You can think of it as the brain talking to organs within the body. You can think of it as one organ talking to another organ in the body. All of that would be fair to assume that there's targets or cells of the body. As far as regulation, you can see here the list. We're going to talk about different hormones that are involved with growth, like growth hormone, thyroid hormones. We're going to talk about hormones responsible for reproduction, like FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone. And then these two, the water balance and electrolyte, we're going to talk about ADH or antidiuretic hormone, and we're going to talk about aldosterone. So we have a lot to cover in this endocrine system. Again, the reason I kept saying take one slide at a time is it can be difficult, and you need to take kind of little bites out of this and not try to cram for this all at one time. So maybe you remember this image. Back here we have the pineal or pineal gland, and we have the hypothalamus, and we have the pituitary. I would go back and review the brain just to make sure you know where these structures are located. Then we have the thyroid here. and the parathyroid, which is on the back side. Remember, dorsal or posterior, it's on the back side of the thyroid. We have the thymus, which we really don't see in adults. It has something to do with immunity that we'll get to in chapter 1. And by the time you're an adult, it pretty much has shrunk and it's not visible. The adrenal glands, that's these little hats that sit on your kidneys. We have our pancreas, and then we have our ovary and our testes. We'll talk about these three here separately at some point. These have both an exocrine and an endocrine function. So what does the endocrine system do for us? We already talked about reproduction, growth and development, maintenance of electrolyte and water balance, regulation of cellular metabolism, that was the T3 and T4, energy balance, and also to mobilize the body defenses. So this, they're talking about immunity, which will, like I said, we'll get to in chapter 21. I would know where these organs are located, and then once we get to the end, I would go back and make a list of all the hormones that come from each organ. So I would write out the pineal, and I know we have melatonin is the only hormone released from the pineal, then go to the hypothalamus and list out, we'll talk about these, but list out all of the hormones that are secreted by the hypothalamus and do the same all the way down. So on to our exocrine versus endocrine function. Remember, this is how we release hormones into the blood, into the blood, and we call them endocrine glands. If you're an exocrine gland, we've already covered these in 201. That's sweat, saliva. They have ducts and they carry the secretion to the surface. So hopefully you remember your kind of little knot of your exocrine glands. Specifically, this one was your sweat gland or your eccrine sweat gland. And then we had a tube, and that tube went up to the surface of our skin, and we're going to secrete sweat. And this is exocrine because it's leaving, right? It's leaving the body, exiting the body. Endocrine, it's staying inside. And then where's it going? It's going into the bloodstream. So they lack ducts and they produce hormones. That's the definition of endocrine. So endocrine glands, pituitary, thyroid, parathyroid, adrenal, and pineal or pineal glands. The hypothalamus is a neuroendocrine organ. So they're trying to separate these for you and be a little bit more specific. Instead of just calling all of these endocrine glands, they want you to know that some of them are strictly endocrine glands and some of them have dual functions. So this is telling you the hypothalamus is part neural and part endocrine. It has two different functions, and you'll see why. So some organs produce both hormones and exocrine products. This is what I was talking about a minute ago when I said we're going to separate out the pancreas and the gonads. Please remember that gonads is a term for the organs that produce gametes. So gonads is not just testes, gonads is ovaries and testes. So the pancreas and the gonads, ovary and testes, all three of these are going to produce an exocrine product and also produce an endocrine product. So the ovary is, if we talked about the exo part, the ovary is going to eject an egg. If we talk about the endo part of the ovary, that's going to release hormones like estrogen and progesterone. Testes, what's the exo part? That's going to be the sperm. And what's the endo part? Hopefully you're saying testosterone to yourself. All right, for the pancreas, the exo, if we look at exo, we're going to look at digestive juices. We won't come back and talk about those until we get to digestion at the end of the semester. But the endo function, you may have heard of something called insulin or glucagon. Sorry, it's getting small. So if I said name the three organs that produce both exocrine and endocrine products, you're going to tell me the pancreas, the ovary, and the testes. We do have some other tissues and organs that produce hormones. We're just going to focus on the top 20. So the most important ones But there are others, and we're finding out new things all the time. We're finding out like bones now actually have a hormone that's released. So it may come to the point that we find there's lots of different tissues within the body that release hormones that we didn't know before, but now we do. So you can see some of these. There are actually some hormones inside your intestines that are released, your stomach, your kidneys, your heart, and we'll cover some of these in more detail as we move into the section. So we'll talk about the hormones released by the kidneys in chapter 17. We'll talk about it again in 18 along with the heart. When we have to talk about water balance and blood pressure. So there's more to come. So again, another study tip, don't do the learn and purge. This endocrine chapter is hard, but it will continue throughout the rest of the semester. So basically every chapter after chapter 16, we're going to talk about some hormone that affects that particular organ system. So basically, just to sum up, hormones, long distance chemical signals that travel in the blood. They added here lymph. Lymph is also fluid that's going to return to the heart. We'll talk more about lymph when we get to Unit 2, but both of these fluids, either your blood or your lymph, both of them are going back to your heart. The lymph fluid just gets cleaned by your lymph nodes before it goes back to your heart. So we're trying to say you can find hormones in your blood, but you can also find them in your lymphatic system. And again, it'll make a little bit more sense once we get to Unit 2. For right now, just know that's where you can find them. On a side note, if you hear somebody talk about the circulatory system, which I think it's on one of my slides coming up in a minute, circulatory system is the combination of both cardiovascular plus lymphatic. So again, if you go back to chapter 1 with those 11 organ systems, you won't see circulatory. You're going to see cardiovascular as one of them, and you're going to see lymphatic as another. But sometimes because both of those fluids end up going back to the heart, or they're part of what we call the circulatory system, the flow of your fluid through your body. So just a little FYI. Okay, autocrines and paracrines are not going to be considered part of the endocrine system. So there are other hormones that are released from other tissues that cause responses locally. So this is not something that's going to travel in your bloodstream and go to various areas throughout the body. The hormones stay local. So an example of an autocrine was or is a prostaglandin. This is just extra information for you guys. You don't have to know it for the exam. But the autocrine is a prostaglandin. It affects smooth muscle, and it can cause your vessels to dilate or constrict. So again, sometimes this stuff is coming later down the road. So in Unit 2, when we talk about blood pressure and we talk about blood vessels and we talk about vasoconstriction or vessel constriction or vasodilation, this prostaglandin will come up again. But for right now, prostaglandin is released by smooth muscle, and that hormone affects only the smooth muscle locally. For a paracrine, sometimes if a cell is damaged, that damaged cell is going to release a chemical signal, and that chemical signal is going to attract macrophages. And so the macrophages, if you remember, are part of your immune system. They have digestive enzymes that can engulf and break down any foreign particle or pathogen. So I know I've said a lot to tell you that we're not considering them part of the endocrine. The reason I'm explaining them is they're going to come up in later chapters. So these, you can think of them as local chemicals that do not travel in the bloodstream over far distances like normal hormones do. If we wanted to break the hormones down into two main classes, they would be first amino acid based and second steroid based. So if I say amino acid to you, you're probably already thinking protein. We remember our biomolecules. What are the 4 molecules necessary for life? We have to have, or biomolecules, larger molecules. We have to have carbohydrates, we have to have proteins, we have to have lipids, and then we have to have nucleic acids, right? This is all back from Anatomy 1, I think chapter 3. So if you have amino acid-based hormones, this means they're made up of amino acids. We should be thinking proteins. They give them different categories or names. So these amines would be epinephrine, norepinephrine. The thyroxine would be what we use to make T3, T4. And then the peptide protein is a big bunch. I'll just give you a few: prolactin, growth hormone, ADH, oxytocin. So lots in that category. I'm not going to list them all. The second type is steroid, and steroids are synthesized from cholesterol. Both of these terms, you should automatically be thinking lipids, right? So some sort of fatty acid tail. So we're talking about gonadal and then adrenocortical or corticoid, you might hear, hormones. So these we'll talk about when we get to ACTH and we get to talking about all of the products from the secretion of ADH. And then the gonadal hormones, what are we talking about? FSH, LH. So just to give you an idea, there are two main classes. What we're going to focus on as we move through this PowerPoint is that if you have two different classes of hormones with one's amino acid and one's steroid, they're going to behave differently. So if you're made up of amino acids, you're going to behave one way. If you're made up of lipids, you're going to behave another way because of the cell membrane, and we'll see that in just a moment. Now we're going to move on to the action of hormones. So hormones circulate, but only the cells with receptors for that hormone are affected. So if you want to think of the hormone as the key, the cell has receptors, and that's the lock. So what we're saying is if you have a cell, let's go back to when we had a muscle cell and we had this acetylcholine receptor. What's the only molecule that could come and bind to this acetylcholine receptor? Well, hopefully it's acetylcholine only. We do have drugs that can mimic, but I don't want to go off on a tangent, right? So acetylcholine can only bind to a cell that made an acetylcholine receptor. So target cells are tissues with receptors for a specific hormone, and then and only then can that hormone bind to the receptor and cause action to happen inside the cell. I don't want you to spend a lot of time on this slide trying to memorize everything. I just wanted to show you what it looks like. So here's a hormone. That hormone is binding to this receptor. Remember, this receptor is a protein, and this protein was made by the cell. And we know we're looking at extracellular fluid and cytoplasm. So this is the inside of the cell, and this is the outside. So this hormone is going to bind to the receptor, and it's going to cause a cascade of events that can activate a protein inside the cell. What can hormones do once they bind to the target cell? Well, you can see there's a whole bunch of activities here. Now, sometimes they make things wordier than it needs to be, right? Alter plasma membrane permeability of membrane potential by opening or closing an ion channel. We've already seen this. You remember we had our muscle cell, and our muscle cell had that acetylcholine receptor, and the gate was closed. But then what happened if acetylcholine bound to it? What happened to the gate? The gate opened, and then what flooded into the muscle cell? We had sodium on the outside, and now the sodium was able to make it through the channel and get into the cell. So a hormone bound to a receptor, and it caused the opening of an ion channel. Remember, this is an ion. Anything that's charged particle is an ion. So we've already seen bullet one, so don't let the wording throw you. We can stimulate synthesis of proteins or regulatory molecules. That was the picture I just showed you. When the hormone bound to the receptor, it caused a cascade of events inside the cell, and it turned on a protein. So it can stimulate the synthesis of a protein. It can activate or deactivate enzymes. I think that's also the previous slide. Induce secretory action. So what we're saying is if a hormone binds to a receptor on a cell, can it cause something to be secreted? Hopefully you're saying yes. So a hormone can bind to a receptor on a cell and have that cell undergo secretion. You could also think of the ovary in this case, right? If it helps, because we've probably heard of this before. So what happens with the ovary? The ovary is going to have hormones that are going to bind it, and those hormones are going to cause the egg to be secreted from the ovary. They can also stimulate mitosis. So a hormone could bind to a cell, bind to a receptor on a cell, and it could cause that cell to divide. So that would be important if we're talking about growth hormone, right? So if growth hormone binds to specific cells, it could cause those cells to divide and therefore grow. Now we're moving into mechanism of action. So remember when I talked about amino acid-based hormones and I said they're going to behave a specific way? Well, this is how they behave. So if you're an amino acid-based hormone, except for thyroid here, thyroid hormones, thyroxine hormones, amino acid-based hormones are water soluble. They cannot enter the target cell. So do we remember we have our phospholipid bilayer? Oh, I hope. I'm not going to draw it all. Y'all know by now I'm not an artist, right? So these are lipids. What happens when water and lipids meet? They repel each other, right? So these water-soluble hormones cannot enter the target cell. They have to act on receptors. So this is kind of the normal way that we've been looking at hormones and receptors. So the majority of the time, the hormone is going to bind to the receptor on the target cell, and then it's going to cause some sort of action to occur inside without the hormone actually going into the cell. So again, this is the same picture that we just saw before. Here's our hormone. It binds to the receptor, and it causes this cascade of events to happen and eventually causes action to happen inside the cell. So hopefully we see that the hormone does not cross the plasma membrane. Remember, we also had steroid-based hormones, and now we're adding thyroids to that as well. So steroid-based, these are lipid-soluble. So remember, steroids are lipid-based. So what happens when you mix a lipid and a lipid? They're fine, right? So what we're saying is that these steroid hormones, because they're lipid-based, they can pass through the plasma membrane and get inside the cell. So in this case, they can enter the cell, and they're going to act on receptors inside. So let's go to the next image. We can see the steroid hormone here. It passes easily through the plasma membrane because they're both lipids. And we still have a receptor, but this time the receptor is inside. It's not on the surface of the cell. The steroid and the receptor bind, and they form this receptor hormone complex. This can get inside the nucleus through the nuclear pore. It can bind to DNA, and it can cause messenger RNA to be read, and then eventually we can translate into a new protein. So hopefully you remember this pathway, DNA to RNA to protein. If not, please go review back in chapter 3. Want to make sure that we understand that hormone synthesis and release is regulated by negative feedback. So one example that we'll see later is that you're going to have one hormone that's going to cause the release of another hormone, which is going to cause the release of more hormones. So you have this cascade of hormone action. So if you have low T3 and T4, these guys are going to be on high. We're going to turn them on. Basically, your body is saying, I don't have enough T3 and T4. We need to start the production. Hurry up. We need to make T3 and T4. As soon as T3 and T4 levels are high enough, we go back and we turn off these hormones. Sometimes this is hard for people to think about. I like to think of it as a light switch. If I need light, I turn the light on. When I don't need light, I turn the light off. It's the same thing with these hormones. There's no reason to release them or expend the energy to make them and release them. If we don't need T3 and T4, there's no point in making the TRH and the TSH stimulus. So basically, try to think of it as a light switch. You turn it on, you start making the hormones. As soon as you have enough hormones, you turn it off. Don't waste any energy. And we call that negative feedback, right? Hopefully you remember that. If not, go back to chapter 1. I'm probably going to say that for every slide, right? Go back to the first chapter. Okay, how are these hormones controlled? So there are certain stimuli that will cause a hormone to be released. So just like this example, the stimulus was, do we have enough T3 and T4? If we have enough, we won't make any more. If we don't have enough, we're going to make more. So we're going to look at these and give examples for each, but I want you to be familiar with these words. So humoral, this you should automatically think blood. Usually humor was the term we used for blood. Neural, obviously, that's going to be a neuron. And hormonal, we're saying a hormone causes another hormone to be released. Here's our example for humoral stimulus. So basically something inside the blood, a blood level of something, is going to directly stimulate the secretion of a hormone. So in this example, we'll go back to what we know, parathyroid hormone, right? So example, calcium level in the blood. Hopefully we remember if you had low blood calcium, that was going to stimulate the parathyroid gland to secrete parathyroid hormone. What does parathyroid hormone do? It causes calcium concentrations to rise and the stimulus is removed. So if you remember we had low blood calcium, we're saying that turned on the parathyroid glands. It causes them to release parathyroid hormone. Do we remember that that hormone went to the osteoclasts and told the osteoclasts to break bone? And what happens when you break bone? You release calcium into the blood. And now your blood calcium levels are going to rise. So do we see that this is a humoral stimulus? What caused parathyroid hormone to be released? Blood calcium level. It was too low. And then do we also see that this is negative feedback? We started with low blood calcium, we initiated these events, and we end up with high blood calcium. You'll see as we move through endocrine that some hormones are released by a neural stimulus. So we're saying the nerve actually causes the hormones to be released. So nerve fibers, stimulate hormone release. One example here, the sympathetic nervous system. They're trying to show you that sympathetic nerves, if you remember, those are your fight or flight. They're going to directly stimulate the adrenal gland, which sits on top of your kidneys, and they're going to secrete something called catecholamines. You might know it as epinephrine and norepinephrine. You might also know it as adrenaline, right? So this is few and far between, but it does happen, especially if we're talking about stress. So if you're under a lot of stress, you can have some hormones released by neural activity. And then they come down here and talk about the fact that your nervous system can override your normal endocrine controls. So again, if you're trying to survive something, if you're doing fight or flight, we don't care about trying to preserve a normal. We're trying to elevate everything so that we can escape from the danger. So under severe stress, the hypothalamus and the sympathetic nervous system can override the normal action of hormones. So in this case, they're overriding insulin to allow blood glucose levels to increase. Probably won't make a lot of sense until we get to the pancreas and talk about this, but we need lots of blood glucose if we're trying to run away from that bear that's chasing us, right? Because we need the glucose in order for our neurons to fire and for our muscles to respond to the increased energy demands by running, right? So don't get too caught up on neural. We'll talk about it in each instance and how it affects. They also just want you to realize that your brain can override some of these normal hormonal functions. Here comes the fun one, the hormonal stimulus. So hormones can stimulate endocrine glands to release their hormones. So we're going to see a pathway that's repeated where we see the hypothalamus is going to release a hormone. That hormone is going to go to the anterior pituitary. That's going to cause another hormone to be released. That hormone is going to go somewhere in the body. It could go to adrenal glands. It could go to other cells within the body, and it can cause them to release hormones. So here we have hormone 1, which is causing hormone 2, which is causing hormone 3. So again, you see kind of this cascade or domino effect of one hormone telling another organ to release another hormone. So they call them hypothalamic hormones, stimulate the release of most anterior pituitary hormones. So you're usually going to have a hypothalamus hormone that's going to dictate to the anterior pituitary which hormones to release. Anterior pituitary hormones will stimulate targets to secrete more hormones. We'll see this pattern as we move through. So the hypothalamic pituitary target endocrine organ feedback loop. Hormones from the final target, inhibit the release of anterior pituitary hormones. We've already seen this. So I said there's this hormone, which then releases this hormone, which then causes this hormone to be released. And if this is high enough, we go back and we shut off these two hormones. So we'll see in another slide exactly where those hormones come from, but they want you to understand what a humoral stimulus is. They want you to realize that the hypothalamus talks to the anterior pituitary, and then the anterior pituitary talks to other organs via the hormones that they secrete. This is a great follow-up slide to explain hormonal stimulus visually, right? Here we have our hypothalamus, and remember this is our brain. And we're going to see one hormone released from the hypothalamus, and you can see it traveling in the bloodstream here. It gets to the anterior pituitary, and then the anterior pituitary can release its hormone, let's say hormone 2. That goes to the next organ, and that hormone 2, causes this organ to release hormone 3. So this is a hormonal stimulus. What caused the thyroid to release H3, or hormone number 3? What was the trigger? The trigger was the anterior pituitary released hormone 2. So sometimes people like to think this is the brain's way of communicating with various organs within the body. Again, they're trying to drive home the point in the textbook to make sure you understand that target cells are specific. So target cells must have specific receptors which the hormone binds. So if I have a cell and this cell has an ACTH receptor, and I have this cell over here and it has none, what's going to happen when ACTH in your blood, what happens when it reaches this cell? It can bind and it can cause action to happen inside the cell. Well, what happens when ACTH goes by this cell? Nothing. There is no ACTH receptor, so there's no place for the ACTH to bind, so therefore that cell is blind. It has no idea. ACTH just went on by. Okay, who cares, right? No instructions for me. I don't need to do anything. So you have to have the specific receptor for that specific hormone in order for the hormone to bind to the cell and cause action inside the cell. Some are only found on certain cells, and some are found on nearly all cells of the body. So this hormone is going to have to do with metabolism. Remember, if you want to think of metabolism as like taking in glucose and breaking it down so that we can make ATP, where would you need that? Well, you would need that on nearly all of the cells. So some hormones are going to affect many more cells than other hormones. When we talk about target cell activation, it is dependent on a couple of factors. So right now I'm talking about if you have a hormone and that hormone binds a receptor on the cell, how long does it stay there? So we have our cell, we have our receptor, we have our hormone bound, and it's causing action inside the cell, right? So how long does the hormone stay bound is dependent on a couple of factors. So the first one is blood levels of the hormone. So hormones are circulating in the blood, and the concentration depends on the rate of release and the speed of removal from the body. So the hormones are broken down, even though we said they're longer lasting, right? They can stay in the bloodstream continually, but they are eventually going to be removed or cleared. And sometimes we talk about the half-life of a hormone. How long does it take for half of the hormone to be decreased, or how long does it take, what's the time required for the hormone from its beginning level to be halved or to be at 50%. If you want to think of it as clearance from the body, that's fine too. So these range. If we're talking about thyroid hormones, we could be talking about 4 minutes. If we're talking about like reproductive hormones like FSH and LH, we could be talking anywhere from 20 minutes to 2 hours. If we're talking about steroids, we haven't talked about this, but like cortisol or glucocorticoids, we could be talking up to 36 hours. So we have a lot of variation in the half-life or the length of a hormone as it's circulating in the bloodstream. The second factor here are the number of receptors. So remember, the target cell makes the receptors. It's responsible for synthesizing them. So a cell can make more receptors or less receptors. So it says the hormone influences the number of their receptors. If you have a decrease in hormone, you're going to see upregulation. Your cells are going to form more receptors. I think of them as hungry little Pac-Men, right? They're like, where's the hormone? Where's the hormone? It's not here. And they start making more receptors. You can also have target cells lose receptors if you constantly have the hormone released. So if the hormone is on overdrive, eventually you're going to lose some of the receptors, and we call that downregulation. You can think of this as why if we increase a drug, it becomes less effective over time. This has to do with downregulation of receptors. So don't get too crazy into talking about this or trying to figure this out. There's lots of ways that we can change upregulation and downregulation through varying the drug levels. It goes into talking about desensitizing target cells to prevent them from overreacting. This is a lot more technical than I want to get into. As long as you understand that hormones can influence the number of receptors, because the cell makes the receptors, the cell can make more receptors or the cell can make less receptors. That's all within the cell's purview, and it usually happens because of increased or decreased hormone. Number 3 here, this is talking about the affinity of binding between the receptor and hormone. They want you to understand briefly that a hormone, hopefully by now you know whenever I draw this, I'm talking about a hormone and a receptor. The lock and the key, sometimes they fit together and they stay attached to each other. That's the binding affinity, more than others. So sometimes a hormone stays attached to the receptor and isn't easily pulled off of the receptor by an enzyme, a degrading enzyme. So there is a binding affinity. So to add to some of the confusion, we can have multiple hormones that act on the same target at the same time. So they list them out here. Permissiveness, this is when one hormone cannot exert its effects without another. Basically, you need a helper. So an example, T3 and T4, those thyroid hormones, those ones that have to do with metabolism, those are necessary for the reproduction hormones to function quickly. So when we talk about like FSH and LH, so they need each other. That's permissiveness. Synergism, this is when one hormone produces the same effect on a target cell. So we have a hormone called glucagon secreted by the pancreas, and then you also have epinephrine coming from the adrenal medulla, and both of those are going to cause the same effect. They're going to cause the liver to release stored glucose. So 2 different hormones, and they both have the same effect. And then antagonism, one or more hormones opposes the action of another. We've already seen this antagonism. We talked about calcitonin versus parathyroid hormone, right? This one brings calcium levels down. This one brings calcium levels up. We're also going to see another one, which is insulin and glucagon. So insulin decreases blood glucose and glucagon increases blood glucose. So they just kind of categorize the fact that some hormones need other hormones, some hormones do multiple actions, and then some are antagonistic. We finally get to move into talking about the actual hormones. So we're going to look at the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus. There's a slide coming up in 2 slides, I think, where we're going to look at the image from the textbook. But your hypothalamus is connected to the pituitary gland via a stalk called the infundibulum. Maybe you remember that the pituitary gland sits in the sella turcica. Do we remember this? Of the sphenoid bone. Remember, it was that little U-shaped saddle, and your pituitary sits right in that. So this has a bony protection. So anything that has a bony protection, that should be telling you that it's important, right? So we have 8 hormones that are secreted, that we're going to talk about, secreted from the pituitary, but the pituitary has 2 lobes. So that it has a back lobe or a dorsal posterior pituitary, and then we have a frontal anterior pituitary. So remember that we said that the hypothalamus was a neuroendocrine gland, and we'll show you why. So here's the pituitary. It comes off of the hypothalamus, and part of it is controlled by neural tissue, and part of it is controlled by endocrine tissue, or hormone talking to another hormone. So first, let's talk about the posterior lobe. Sometimes you'll see me abbreviated as post-pit, so I don't have to write it out. This is actually a downgrowth of hypothalamic neural tissue. There's a neural connection between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary. The 2 hormones that we're going to talk about are oxytocin and this antidiuretic hormone. Oxytocin is usually abbreviated OT. Hormones are stored in the axon terminals in the posterior pituitary and are released into the blood when a neuron fires. You can tell this is a lot of neuro words, right? So posterior pituitary is really functioning like a neuron. Again, here's our hypothalamus, right? We can see that. Here is our ant pit, which we'll talk about next, anterior pituitary, and here is our post pit. Do you see how we have a neuron? Here's the soma, the dendrites. Here's the axon, and the axon comes all the way down to here, and we can see our axon terminals. So the posterior pituitary is a little bit different. It acts more like a neuron, and is the neuro part of the hypothalamus. So you can see we have these 2 sets of neurons. The axons travel through the infundibulum, and the axon terminals are in the posterior pituitary. So when this neuron fires, any of these fire, they're going to cause the release of hormones from the axon terminal. So hopefully we can see why this is more neurally regulated. What are the 2 hormones? Oxytocin and ADH. Okay, the first hormone we're going to talk about is oxytocin. So let's go back and review just for a second. So what's the stimulus? What causes oxytocin to be released? Something to do with the hypothalamus and something to do with nerve stimulation, right? What's the gland? What's the gland that releases oxytocin? Hopefully you're telling me right now posterior pituitary. Where does it go? What's the target? And then what's the function? Well, right here I have the functions listed. Stimulates uterine contractions and triggers milk ejection. So that's the function. So what do you think the target organs are? Well, if it's going to cause uterine contractions, one of the targets has to be uterus. And if it triggers milk to be ejected from your mammary glands, well, it has to target breast tissue, right? Or breast mammary glands, however you want to word it. This is not the same as producing milk, so just be careful. This is a letdown reflex in women who are already producing milk. We will talk about prolactin, which is different. Prolactin, making milk. So oxytocin is just the release. So hopefully we can see that the stimulus is going to be the hypothalamus, some sort of nerve stimulation. The gland that releases oxytocin is posterior pituitary. The target organs are the uterus and the breast. And what does oxytocin do once it gets to the uterus and the breast? Well, it stimulates uterine contractions and it triggers milk letdown. Hopefully by now you're thinking about childbirth, right? So as your uterus grows, so as your uterus gets larger, you increase the number of receptors. And then once oxytocin binds those receptors, that stimulates the contractions. So that's the onset of childbirth. Maybe you guys have heard of Pitocin. Pitocin is artificial. That's artificial oxytocin. So sometimes women who don't make enough oxytocin, or there's something wrong with receptors, or their labor is not onset, they want to induce labor, they're going to give you an artificial, which is Pitocin. And why does artificial Pitocin work? Well, here's your cells of your uterus, and here's the receptor. And what would normally bind here is oxytocin, but guess what? Pitocin looks so similar that it can bind to the same receptor, and then it can trigger the uterine cells to initiate contraction. So hopefully if you're filling out the chart that you can find in Blackboard under lab material, it should say hormone chart. Hopefully if you're filling this in, this should make a little bit more sense to you. In addition to stimulating uterine contractions and triggering milk ejection, oxytocin also plays a role in sexual arousal and orgasm in males and females. So sometimes people will talk about after orgasm and you have this euphoric light feeling. Sometimes they call this the cuddle hormone. Now we have antidiuretic hormone. Again, it's an amino acid based hormone. So is oxytocin. This basically, let's go through the same thing again. If we have a stimulus and we have our gland and we have our target and then we have our function. So the stimulus, again, it's going to have something to do with the hypothalamus. It's going to have something to do with nerve transmission. So something's going to trigger the nerve in the hypothalamus to fire. That's going to cause your posterior pituitary to release ADH. And what's the target? Where is ADH going to go? We're going to see in just a second. It's going to target the kidneys. So ADH is released if your solute concentration is too high. So hypothalamic osmoreceptors respond to changes in solute concentration of the blood. So they're saying this up here, hypothalamus nerve, what does it do? It senses that your solute of your blood is too high. So what I would write in my box for antidiuretic hormone and stimulus trigger, I would write solute levels trigger the hypothalamus nerve to release ADH, specifically if solute concentration is high. Hopefully by now we know the difference between a solute, a solvent, and a solution. Usually in Anatomy 2, I tell people if you want to think of solute, in this case as salt, that's fine. When we talk about water, sometimes it helps to just pick one electrolyte and think about that electrolyte. So remember, if you have this solution and it has a whole bunch of salt in it, or solute, you would say the solute is high. Versus if you have the same volume of solution and now the solute is low. So if your solute concentration is too high, osmoreceptors are going to depolarize and send impulses to the hypothalamic neurons. That's going to trigger your posterior pituitary to release ADH. And when ADH is released, it's going to target your kidney tubules and inhibit urine formation. So urine, something diuretic, something that makes you release water or urine, anti-stop. So this hormone is really important. I'm going to move to the next slide and we'll talk about it a little bit more. So why should I care about this? Why should I learn about these stupid hormones and where they go and what they do? How is this relevant? Well, guess what? ADH helps you survive if you're lost in the desert and you're hot and you're sweating and you're dehydrated. So I think you should care, right? So you're in the desert and you're hot, you're sweating, you have no immediate water supply. ADH secretion is stimulated, your kidneys stop excess water loss, and guess what? You live a little bit longer. So what's happening is your hypothalamus is detecting solute levels. If your solute is high, they're saying your amount of salt is high relative to water. So if I say that, I'm saying your solute is high, what's your water? If your solute is high, your water is low. So your hypothalamus detects that your solute levels are out of whack, specifically that your solute level is too high. That means you don't have enough water. Your water is really low. So what does that tell your hypothalamus to do? It fires the neuron. That message goes to the posterior pituitary where you have your axon terminal, and your axon terminal has in it a hormone called ADH. So you release the ADH. Where does the ADH go? Goes to your kidneys, and it tells your kidneys, keep water. We need more. So your water was low. We enact this chain of events, and what happens to your water level? It increases. This can keep you alive for a short period of time. That you can live with water live without water for 5 to 7 days, about that. So 15%, losing about 15% of your total volume of water can be lethal, right? So mostly our body is about 60% water, depending, 50 to 60%. So just losing 15% can affect your blood pressure, your blood volume, can make you pass out, can actually be lethal. You aren't getting enough blood to all of your organs because the majority of your blood is water. So these hormones are important. Also, I know for a fact when you get to drug interactions, if you're doing any sort of allied health after this, you have to understand how drugs can affect these solute concentrations. So these electrolytes are going to become important. You're going to have to know about sodium and potassium and calcium and how they move around, bicarbonate. You're going to have to know how hormones affect those levels within the body, and then know the normal hormones, and then know what happens if I give you a drug and how that synthetic drug affects the normal amount of hormones and activity that you have. So again, another study tip, don't try to blow this off and just memorize it. If you really understand it, you will be saving yourself tons of time later. So let's see what happens when the solute is low. So if you have low solute, that means that in relationship, you have high water. So basically, you have enough water. We do not need to release ADH. We do not need to tell the kidneys to keep every drop of water. We have plenty of water. We have enough. So if your solute concentration is low, you have no firing of neurons. Where would that be? That would be in the hypothalamus. What happens in the posterior pituitary? No ADH release, right? If the neuron doesn't fire, you don't release ADH. So what's going to happen? If you don't have ADH, your kidneys, instead of keeping every drop of water, they're going to release water in form of urine. So if your solute concentration is low, if you have enough water, no ADH is going to be released, and your kidneys will just release water in your urine as a normal process. One thing to mention here is that alcohol inhibits ADH release. So if you're drinking lots of alcohol, you're inhibiting ADH release, but it might not be due to the fact that you have enough water. So ADH is suppressed or inhibited by alcohol, even if you needed to keep water, you wouldn't be able to because the alcohol is stopping the ADH from doing its job. Also interesting, at really high concentrations, sometimes we'll release ADH. Like if you have severe blood loss, you can release ADH and it causes vasoconstriction. So it causes your valves, excuse me, your vessels to get smaller. So at high concentrations of ADH cause vasoconstriction, usually due to like significant blood loss, hemorrhaging, something of that nature. And so that's why sometimes you might hear ADH referred to as vasopressin. Here's the table from our book that explains a little bit more about oxytocin and antidiuretic. If you're filling in the hormone chart that I handed out in class, you're going to see oxytocin is stimulated by hypothalamic neurons in response to cervical or uterine stretching and infant suckling at the breast. What is the target organ? So where does oxytocin go? It's going to go to the uterus or to the breast tissue. And what is it going to do, right? It's going to cause uterine contractions. And it's also going to cause milk letdown. This is not the same thing as making milk. That is going to be prolactin. So initiates milk ejection and it stimulates uterine contractions. For antidiuretic hormone, so where does antidiuretic hormone come from? It comes from the posterior pituitary as well. It's stimulated by hypothalamic neurons in response to blood solute concentrations. Where does antidiuretic hormone go? It goes to the kidneys. And what does it tell the kidneys to do? To reabsorb water. So here are some clinical issues, some homeostatic imbalances that can happen. If you have diabetes insipidus, basically you're deficient in ADH. So something's wrong with the hypothalamus or the posterior pituitary and you do not make ADH. Remember, ADH, when it's released, is going to go to the kidneys and tell the kidneys to keep water, right? So if you're dehydrated, this is a great hormone that'll allow you to reabsorb water in your kidneys and keep you hydrated. So if you don't have this, you can't keep water. So guess what? You have to make sure that you stay very well hydrated. There's also the inappropriate ADH secretion. So this is the abbreviation for the syndrome of. What happens is you have too much. So this is too much ADA where this was too low, right? So you have too much ADA being secreted, and that means you're constantly keeping fluid. So remember, when ADH is on, you retain as much fluid as possible. So retention of fluid, this can lead to edema, right? Swelling. This can put pressure on your brain and cause headaches, disorientation. What are we going to do to try to fix this? We're going to restrict the amount of fluid that you consume. And we also are going to monitor your blood sodium levels. We want to make sure that that stays in balance for our resting membrane potential. Now we're moving on to the anterior lobe of the pituitary. And this relationship between the anterior and the hypothalamus is connected by something called the hypophyseal portal system. So remember, in this case, if you're going from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary, you're doing that by way of blood flow. This is different because if we go from hypothalamus to posterior pituitary, this is a nerve, right? So now we're talking about blood flow, and so this hypophyseal portal system is what connects the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary. The hypothalamus is going to secrete releasing and inhibiting hormones that are going to target the anterior pituitary and cause it to release hormones. Here's a great image from your textbook. You can see the hypothalamus here. You can see the neurons that would go into the posterior pituitary. And then over here, you can see the hypophyseal portal system. So we're saying hormones are going to be released from the hypothalamus. They're going to travel into the bloodstream, and they're going to target the anterior pituitary to release these 6 hormones. And we're going to talk about each one of these in detail. So of the 6 hormones that are released, 4 of the 6 are tropic. All tropic means is this hormone is going to go someplace else in the body and tell another gland to release its hormone. So they call them tropic. If you remember from before in this lecture, we said tropic means that one hormone is going to go and cause the release of another hormone. So we'll look at these four. So TSH is going to go to the thyroid and cause the thyroid to release T3 and T4. Adrenocorticotropic hormone is going to go from the anterior pituitary to the adrenal gland and cause the adrenal gland to release hormone. And these are going to go to the ovaries and the testes and cause those to release hormones. So just trying to explain to you what tropic means. So the first hormone that we're going to talk about released from the anterior pituitary is called growth hormone. So growth hormone is regulated by growth hormone releasing hormone. So the hypothalamus is going to release growth hormone releasing hormone. That is going to go to the anterior pituitary and cause it to release growth hormone. And then growth hormone is going to target the liver, skeletal muscles, bones, and others and cause them to do what? Grow. This one, growth hormone inhibiting hormone. Once you've grown enough, this is going to be released from the hypothalamus. So now the hypothalamus releases growth hormone inhibiting hormone, and we stop the release of growth hormone. And then you stop growing. We're not growing our entire lives, right? Through adolescence, we're doing lots of growing. In adulthood, we are not. We can see again the direct action of growth hormone. Growth hormone is going to go to the liver, to the skeletal muscles, to the bone, to cartilage, and it's going to produce growth factors. And it's going to cause all of those targeted or muscles, liver, bones, cartilage to grow. And it does so by a number of ways. So let's look at the next slide. You can see here in this flow chart, we're going to see growth hormone releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. That's going to go to the anterior pituitary and cause the anterior pituitary to release growth hormone. Growth hormone is going to go to the liver. We're going to see the production of insulin-like growth factors, and we're going to see the effect happen on the skeletal, extraskeletal fat, and carbohydrate metabolism. So growth hormone can act directly to increase fat breakdown, right? We're going to turn this fat and use it to make ATP. We're going to increase blood glucose because we know if we have increased glucose, then we can make more ATP, and that's the energy we're going to use to grow. And we can also cause growth in our skeletal, increase in cartilage and skeletal formation. We can also increase protein synthesis and cell growth and proliferation. So growth hormone has several effects here, whether we're talking just about carbohydrates and fat metabolism or whether we're actually talking about growth. Again, with the clinical aspect, what happens if we have too much? So if you have a hypersecretion of growth hormone caused by some sort of tumor on the anterior pituitary, in children, if you have increased growth hormone, you could end up with gigantism. So reaching, more than your normal height, 8 feet here. In adults, they call it acromegaly. So if you have an overexcretion of growth hormone in adulthood, it seems to only affect the hands, the feet, and the face. These are the bones that are still able to grow in width. So these are the areas that we see that overgrowth. For hyposecretion of growth hormone, in children, it results in something called pituitary dwarfism. So you don't have enough growth hormone. And the reason we call it pituitary dwarfism is the problem is there's something wrong with the pituitary. There's also achondroplasia, which is a genetic form. So this one, they're talking specifically about dwarfism due to the fact that you're having a pituitary hormone issue, where achondroplasia, there's a genetic issue. And that's why the dwarfism occurs. So now we're moving on to the second one, second anterior pituitary hormone. This is thyroid stimulating hormone. So this is going to stimulate the normal development and secretory activity of the thyroid. It's going to make the thyroid release its hormones, which are T3 and T4. So the regulation of thyroid stimulating hormone by thyrotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus releases TRH. TRH goes to the anterior pituitary and causes it to release TSH. TSH is going to go to the thyroid, and it's going to cause the thyroid to release T3 and T4. The bottom bullet there, it says inhibited by rising blood levels of thyroid hormone. So basically this is like a light switch. If we turn this one on, or let's go back to hypothalamus. If this is on, then TSH is on, then we make T3 and T4. Once these levels get really high, we go back and we shut off TSH and we shut off TRH. There's no point in telling the thyroid to make hormones if it's already making them. So basically you turn the light on, you get the thyroid to start making hormones, and then you turn the light off. So this is a great figure to explain that. They're showing you the hypothalamus is releasing TRH. TRH targets the anterior pituitary to release TSH. TSH is going to go to the thyroid, and it's going to start pumping out thyroid hormones, which are T3 and T4. T3 and T4 is going to go off in the body and cause action to happen to target cells. What they're saying is if your T3 and T4 gets high enough, it goes back and shuts off the release of these hormones. So basically, we're going to turn on, on, on. Once these get high enough, we're going to come back and say off, off. Now we're on to the third in the list, adrenocorticotropic hormone. I like this wording. Adreno tells you where it's going. It's going to the adrenal gland. Cortico here tells you what it's going to release. It's going to stimulate the release of cortico hormones. And then the tropic part tells you it's going to release hormones, and those hormones are going to cause more hormones to be released. So ACTH stimulates the adrenal cortex to release corticosteroids. It's regulated by hypothalamic corticotropin releasing hormone. There are some other factors such as fever, hypoglycemia, so that's low blood glucose, and stressors that can alter the release of CRH. So on this one, you're going to have to think about two things at the same time, right? So we're saying stress can cause the release of CRH, and that's from the hypothalamus. CRH is going to go to the anterior pituitary, and it's going to cause the anterior pituitary to release ACTH. This is going to go to the adrenal cortex, specifically cortex, and it's going to help release those corticosteroids. And we're going to talk about several of these that are released. So it's really stress, which can also trigger CRH, but then also CRH is just released in a daily rhythm. So there's really two factors here. It's just CRH or it's stress-induced release of CRH. On to the next one. This is gonadotropins. So this is the group for these two. So we've already talked about growth hormone. We talked about thyroid stimulating hormone. We talked about ACTH. Now we're talking about FSH, LH, and then eventually we'll talk about prolactin. So these two are in a group called gonadotropins. So gonads, something to do with egg or sperm. Oops, let me spell that right. Sperm. And they're trophins, they're tropic because they're going to cause another hormone to be released. So these two hormones, FSH and LH, are secreted by the anterior pituitary. FSH is going to stimulate gamete production, so egg or sperm. LH is going to promote the production of hormones. So if I had to do a little chart here, I'm kind of run out of room, but if I had to say hypothalamus, it's going to release a gonadotropin releasing hormone. That gonadotropin is going to go to the anterior pituitary and cause it to release both FSH and LH, And then those are going to go to the ovary or to the testes, and it's going to cause them to do one of two things. If it's FSH, it's going to stimulate gamete. If it's LH, it's going to stimulate hormones. So I kind of jumped the gun a little bit. Here's our regulation. So what causes FSH and LH to be released? It's triggered by gonadotropin releasing hormone, GnRH. And this is coming from, hypothalamus. So again, the hypothalamus is going to release GnRH. That's going to cause the anterior pituitary to release FSH and LH. These are going to go to the gonads. If it's FSH, it's going to have to do with gametes, making egg and sperm. If it's LH, it's going to have to do with making more hormones. So the sixth hormone is prolactin. Prolactin is regulated by prolactin inhibiting hormone, which is the same structure as dopamine. So prolactin inhibiting hormone prevents the release of prolactin unless it's needed or until needed. So estrogen blood levels stimulate prolactin. Prolactin blood levels rise towards the end of pregnancy, and suckling stimulates prolactin hormone release and promotes milk production. So basically, if your prolactin inhibiting hormone is low, then you're going to release prolactin. That prolactin is obviously going to go to breast tissue, and you're going to do what? You're going to produce milk. So hypersecretion or hypo. If you have hypersecretion of prolactin, you could have inappropriate lactation, probably due to some sort of tumor that's affecting your anterior pituitary. It can also affect fertility. It can also affect menstruation or menses. So we'll talk more about this when we get to reproduction chapter. Hyposecretion, if you're not making PRL, that just means you have low or no breast milk. Well, now that's not such a big deal, right? Unless you want a nurse, then it might be a big deal for you, but we always have synthetic breast milk, right? So basically these tables kind of provide a summary. So we're looking at growth hormone. We know that it's released from the anterior pituitary. It's stimulated by growth hormone releasing hormone. Remember that came from the hypothalamus. So GHRH from the hypo is going to stimulate the anterior pituitary to release growth hormone. Where's this growth hormone going to go? Liver, muscles, bone, cartilage. What's it going to do? Mobilize fat, spare glucose. And what happens if you have too much or too little? So if you have too little, you could be short in stature, pituitary dwarfism. If you have too much, you could have gigantism, right? And those are both in children. And then we call it acromegaly if you're an adult and all of a sudden you're producing lots of growth hormone. Much more detail on this picture, right? So here's thyroid stimulating hormone. We know it comes from the anterior pituitary. What stimulates thyroid stimulating hormone to be released? It's TRH, or thyrotropin releasing hormone. Remember that comes from the hypothalamus. Where does it go? Where does thyroid stimulating hormone go? It goes to the thyroid, and it causes the thyroid to release thyroid hormones. What happens if you have too little? What happens if you have too much? Now we have adrenocorticotropic hormone. Again, these are all from the pituitary, right? Adrenocorticotropic hormone stimulated by CRH, corticotropic releasing hormone, again from the hypothalamus. Are we kind of seeing that anything that says releasing hormone probably came from the hypothalamus? Okay, so adrenocorticotropic hormone is stimulated by CRH released from the hypothalamus. Where does it go? It goes to the adrenal cortex, and it promotes the release of glucocorticoids, mineralocorticoids, which we'll get into later, but we really call them corticosteroids. So if you want to use that term right now, that's fine. What happens if you have too many, or what happens if you have too few? So we'll talk more about Cushing's disease when we get to adrenal glands, so just hang on. So follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. What stimulates them? Both gonadotropin releasing hormone. That came from hypothalamus. Where do both of those go? FSH and LH go to both the ovaries and the testes. Follicle stimulating hormone is going to be gamete production, right? Ovarian follicle and sperm production. Luteinizing hormone, it's going to be estrogens, testosterone, progesterones, more to do with the hormones. What happens if you have too few hormones, or what happens if you have too much? Not so many effects if you have too much. If you don't have enough of these hormones, it could delay sexual maturity. And then prolactin, we know that's released from the anterior pituitary. It's stimulated by a decrease in PIH. And where does it go? It goes to the breast tissue and promotes lactation. What happens if you have too much? What happens if you have too little? Now we move on to the thyroid. So we're going to look at the structure, but real quick, we should be able to write this out now. Hypothalamus releases TRH. That goes to the anterior pituitary and causes it to release TSH. TSH is going to go to the thyroid, and the thyroid is going to release T3 and T4. So we have this nice tropic pathway where one hormone causes the release of another hormone, which causes the release of a third hormone. So where is your thyroid? You can see it's butterfly shaped. It's on the anterior portion of the neck. It's inferior to the larynx, so below the larynx. And we have some terms here: follicle, colloid, parafollicular cells. So I'll show you the image and it'll probably help a little bit. But remember, those parafollicular cells produce calcitonin. So if I asked you name 3 hormones that are produced by the thyroid, you should be able to tell me T3, T4, and then calcitonin. So these are all produced by the thyroid. Here's an image for you. You can see the thyroid here below the larynx, anterior to the trachea. And this is what it looks like underneath the microscope. So you have these really large cells. This is the very first photo that we looked at from chapter 16. These are called follicles. These cells are called follicular cells. This space is called the colloid, right? And then over here, you see how there's a pocket of cells? Those are called parafollicular cells. These are the ones that are going to make calcitonin. These are the ones that are going to make T3 and T4. So thyroid hormone, this is the major metabolic hormone in the body. So when I say metabolic to you, you should be thinking of building up or breaking down products, chemicals, compounds. You may know the term catabolism or anabolism. So to break down or to build up. Remember, we have to take glucose and we have to break glucose down into its individual components, and we use that energy in breaking of those bonds to produce ATP. So when we say metabolic hormone, it's going to have something to do with your metabolism, how quickly you can break down compounds and how quickly you can build compounds. So thyroid, we have 2. We keep talking about T3 and T4. So there's 2 different forms of thyroid hormone. One is thyroxine and the other one is triiodothyronine or threonine. So if it's a 4, it has 2 tyrosine molecules and 4 iodine. If you're T3, you have 2 tyrosines and you have 3 iodines. So why 2 forms? Just think about this for a second. Redundancy usually means something. If we have 2 different hormones, there's a reason that we make them. So thyroid hormones, if I'm talking about T3 and T4, will affect almost every cell in the body. They're going to enter the target cell. They're going to bind intracellular. So right away you should be thinking of steroid-based, right? Not water-based. They trigger transcription. That should ring a bell to you, something about DNA to RNA, and then remember RNA is going to be translated into a protein. So various metabolic genes get turned on, and this increases your metabolic rate. Also heat production. Please remember that if we do cellular respiration, so glucose plus oxygen yields water plus carbon dioxide plus ATP, right? When you're turning glucose into ATP, you are also releasing heat. Everybody should be able to write this equation for cellular respiration. There's a table in your book that shows all the major effects of thyroid hormone, but thyroid hormone is one of those hormones that's going to work, is synergistic. It's going to work with other hormones. So thyroid hormone actually can help maintain your normal blood pressure. So if your thyroid hormone is too low or your thyroid hormone is too high, it directly affects your blood pressure. Regulation of tissue growth. So if we have growth hormone, we kind of also need thyroid hormone. Remember, if you're growing, do you need to have an increased metabolism? Yes. And then it's directly involved with nervous cell and skeletal development and can also play a role in fertility or reproductive capabilities. So it can work in conjunction with FSH and LH as well. So here's a figure from your book showing you how T3 and T4 is assembled. So a lot of people like to just memorize these little blurbs here. You can do that, but it really doesn't help in the long term. What I would suggest is, can you look at this picture and can you follow what's happening and put it in your own words? So here we're looking at the follicular cell and we're looking at the colloid. So here is iodide. It comes in through your capillary. So this is from your blood. So where do you get it? You get it from the food that you eat. So iodide comes in, it travels across the follicular cell, and when it gets into the colloid, it's now iodine. This is a cell, right? This whole squiggly thing is a cell. It has rough ER, this is where we make proteins. It has a Golgi apparatus, this is how we transport proteins, right? So let's erase all that so we can start over again. So the iodide is going to travel through the follicular cell into the colloid. This is the colloid. And now it's going to be iodide. The cell is going to make a protein and package that protein and ship it into the colloid. And so here we see tyrosines. So the follicular, if I had to label this, this is the thyroid follicular cell. That's what makes the tyrosine. Where do we get the iodine? We get it from our blood. So now we assemble what we call dits and mits. The D is for 2, di, the M is for mono, which is 1. So I took one of these tyrosines and I attached 2 iodides to it. And then I took another tyrosine and I attached 1. So you have dits and mits. Well, guess what? What happens if I take a dit and a dit? I should end up with a T4. What happens if I take a dit and a mit? I should end up with a T3. So here's a T3. You can see that it's a mit and a dit put together. And then we shuttle those hormones back across the follicular cell into our bloodstream. So you can think of the colloid as kind of the assembly, the area for assembly. Make sure that you understand that the iodide comes from the food that you eat, traveling in your bloodstream, and that it crosses over the follicular cell until you have iodide on the inside. Basically, it's oxidized. And then we're going to make the tyrosine from the follicular cell. We're going to assemble everybody in the colloid, and then we're going to ship them back into the bloodstream. This is basically in words what we just said. So the thyroid gland stores hormones in the follicle lumen, that's the colloid, until triggered by the TSH to release. So you're going to make thyroglobulin. We saw it listed as tyrosine in that other picture. The iodides are actively taken into the cell, oxidized to iodine, and then released into the lumen. Again, this lumen, they're talking about colloid. The iodine attaches to tyrosine, and then this obviously is done by some sort of enzyme activity. Once we have the iodine and the tyrosines linked together, we're going, so these, they're talking about the dits and the mits. Oops, mits. Oops, mits. Once you create the dits and the mits, we're going to link them together to form the T3 and the T4. T3 and T4 are going to diffuse into the bloodstream. So now we're finally getting to why 2. So remember we were thinking about that question, why do we bother making 2? So these T3s and T4s are transported. They'll bind to target receptors, but the T3 is 10 times more active than the T4. But guess what? If I just pluck off one of the iodines, I now have converted T4 to T3, right? T4 is converted to T3 in peripheral tissues. This means kind of outer tissues. So what we're saying is once you make T3 and T4, it's released from the thyroid. This is ready now. It's active. This T4 can travel in your bloodstream, and all we have to do is turn it into T3, and now it becomes active. So you have some hormone that you can use right now, and you have some that'll be converted once it gets to the outer tissue or the peripheral tissue, like your arms and your legs. They're following up here just to make sure you know that thyrotropin releasing hormone comes from the hypothalamus, triggers the anterior pituitary to release TSH. TSH goes to the thyroid, causes thyroid hormones, that's T3 and T4. And where do these thyroid hormones go? They go to target cells within the body. Once your T3 and T4 is high enough, we're going to go back and shut off the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. So as soon as your T3, T4 levels are high enough, we're going to go back and shut off the stimulus. This would be an example of negative feedback. Again, we have some clinical homeostatic imbalances. What happens if you have hyposecretion? So you have low T3 and T4, right? Low thyroid hormones can lead to something called myxedemia. So basically this is low metabolic rate. This is thick or dry skin, puffy eyes, feeling chilled, constipated, edema. So this is swelling, right? Water. Mental sluggishness and lethargia. So if you have hypothyroidism, this is what you can expect. But all we have to do is give you synthetic T3 and T4. Sometimes, if you have a lack of iodine, you'll form a goiter. The thyroid is going to enlarge because you're not getting the iodine from your diet in order to make your T3 and T4. So you're making tons of tyrosine. That tyrosine is all in the colloid, stuck in the colloid, and can't get out. So then you have this goiter or this enlargement of the thyroid. In infants, if you have hypothyroidism, sometimes it's referred to as cretinism. This is going to affect your intellectual ability. It's going to affect your growth hormone. So remember that thyroid hormone also plays a role with growth hormone, right? We said thyroid hormone was really important for nervous system. So if your thyroid hormone is low when you're developing, it's going to lead to some of these problems. So here we have hypersecretion. You might also see hyperthyroidism. Most common type is Graves' disease. So this is when we have antibodies that mimic TSH. So remember, TSH comes from your anterior pituitary, and it causes your thyroid to make T3 and T4. So let's say this isn't being released, but now you have this mimic. So this antibody is mimicking TSH, and it's telling your thyroid, make more, make more. So what happens to your T3, T4? You just start making tons and tons of T3 and T4. So this is hyperthyroidism. So elevated metabolic rate, right? Sweating, nervousness, irregular heartbeats, weight loss. You might see this protruding of the eyes or bulging of the eyes. Basically, the tissue behind the eyes fills with fluid. They think maybe the antibodies are attracted to that area for some reason as well. And with the antibodies also goes water, so that you end up with your eyes kind of protruding out. Here's an example of a goiter. This would have something to do with hypothyroidism, also something to do with not getting enough iodine in your diet. Here we can see the bulging eyes, and this would be a sign of hyperthyroidism. Sometimes we get so caught up in the thyroid hormones that we forget to talk about calcitonin, or remember. So remember, the parafollicular cells in the thyroid, which respond to high calcium levels. Remember, this is an antagonist to parathyroid hormone. So please remember that if your blood calcium levels are high, that is what triggers calcitonin to be released from the thyroid. And then that calcitonin is basically going to try to bring your blood calcium level down. It's going to inhibit osteoclasts, so stop releasing calcium. And then it's going to stimulate calcium uptake. So it's going to tell your osteoblasts, take the extra calcium and build bone. We covered this in 201, so I'm not going to go over it in great detail. If you want to go back to chapter 6, and when we talked about the bones, and look at calcitonin and parathyroid hormone. If you remember, parathyroid hormone is released from the parathyroid gland. So these are usually 4, sometimes 8 tiny glands that are on the posterior aspect of the thyroid. So they're separate glands. So the parathyroid gland is just next to the thyroid, but it's separate from the thyroid. So they're going to release parathyroid hormone, and this is important in calcium homeostasis. Remember that we need calcium for lots of things, right? So for clotting, we need calcium. For nervous cell transmission or neuron transmission, and we need it for all muscle action. So we need to make sure that we have lots of calcium. So if your blood calcium level is low, that's going to trigger parathyroid hormone to be released, and that's going to cause you to try to keep as much calcium as possible. So here are the target organs: skeleton, kidneys, and intestines. It is supposed to take low blood levels of calcium, and that hormone is supposed to tell your body to keep every drop of calcium you possibly can. Here's a nice figure from your book. They're showing you the parathyroid glands on the back, and they're saying in response to low blood calcium, you're going to release parathyroid hormone from your parathyroid glands. They're going to tell your bones, your kidneys, and your intestines to keep or reabsorb as much calcium as possible. So your blood calcium was low, you secrete parathyroid hormone, and that tells bones, kidneys, and intestines to reabsorb all the calcium that it can back into your bloodstream. So what happens if you have too much parathyroid hormone? If you have too much, you're constantly leaching calcium from your bones. Remember, parathyroid says absorb as much as you possibly can. Well, if it's constantly being released, you're going to keep absorbing from your bones, and you're going to leach the calcium out. It can cause your bones to be soft and deform. Calcium needs to be just right. You don't want too high or you don't want too low. You want right in the right area, right in the middle. So if your calcium is too high in your bloodstream, so blood calcium is too high, it can actually disrupt that membrane potential, that resting membrane potential. It can depress your nervous system, and it also causes formation of kidney stones. If you have hypoparathyroidism, so your parathyroid hormone is too low, that can cause hypocalcemia. So that means low calcium in your blood. And remember, low calcium isn't very good either. It can result in tetany. This is like seizures. unwanted muscle action due to the fact that your calcium level is so low. Again, it's because if you don't have just the right calcium level, it interferes with your resting membrane potential. You can have respiratory paralysis, and it can even lead to death. So very important. Now we move on to adrenal glands. So these are the pyramid-shaped organs on top of the kidneys. Sometimes they're called supra for superior renal kidney glands. There's actually two glands in one. There's the medulla, which is thought of as the middle, and the cortex, which is thought as the outer ring. So this area of the adrenal gland produces many different hormones, collectively called corticosteroids. We're going to focus on the main ones. We're going to look at aldosterone, cortisol, and when I say sex hormones, hopefully you can think of estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. So there are layers in the adrenal cortex. This is the zona glomerulosa, and it's responsible for making the group called mineralocorticoids, and the one that we're going to look at is aldosterone. Then you have the zona fasciculata, which produces the group called the glucocorticoids. The one that we're going to look at is cortisol. And then you have zona reticularis, which produces a group called gonadotropins. And obviously, as the name gives you a clue, that it has something to do with sex hormones. So here you can see the zona glomerulosa. That's this area, this layer. And this is going to produce aldosterone. Then here we have the zona fasciculata. This is going to produce cortisol. And then we have the zona reticularis. This is going to be the sex hormones. I'm just going to abbreviate. Here's the division line between the adrenal medulla and the adrenal cortex. So the first group we're going to talk about is mineralocorticoids, and the one we need to look at is aldosterone. So basically, these are going to regulate electrolytes. So remember, electrolytes, anything that's positive or negatively charged, primarily it's going to regulate sodium and potassium. So remember the effects of sodium, right? Sodium helps set up that resting membrane potential. We're also going to look at other ions at some point in the semester, like bicarbonate and chloride. Remember, the potassium also sets the resting membrane potential. So remember, if you had your muscle here, you had your sodium on the outside and you had your potassium on the inside, and that's what set your resting membrane potential. Eventually, the sodium is going to come in and the potassium is going to leave during relaxation, right? So aldosterone is the most potent mineralocorticoid. It stimulates sodium reabsorption and water retention by the kidneys. These are co-transported. So if I take sodium back into my bloodstream, I don't release it in my urine, guess what follows? Water follows. And when we take sodium back and water back, what gets eliminated? Potassium. So these two are always at odds with each other. If we take sodium back in, we're going to kick out potassium. These two are in relation to each other. Anytime we take in sodium, we also take in water. We'll talk about it when we get to urinary. So these are all the mechanisms of aldosterone secretion. So if you have decreased blood pressure, that's going to stimulate the kidneys to release renin into the blood. So the kidneys make renin. It's going to convert to angiotensin II. Angiotensin II will cause aldosterone to be released. And if aldosterone is released, you reabsorb sodium and you reabsorb water. So if your blood pressure was decreased, aldosterone turns on, and what do? I reabsorb sodium, I reabsorb water. What happens to my blood pressure? It's going to go up. So just something to keep in mind, if your sodium goes up, that means your water is going to go up. I mean back into your bloodstream. So if you reabsorb sodium, you reabsorb water, what's going to happen to your blood volume? You're going to have more water in it, so increased blood volume, and that's going to cause increased blood pressure. If your plasma concentration of potassium is too high, so you have high potassium. How do I get rid of high potassium? If I have, sorry, let me start over, it's hard to see. If I have high potassium and I want to kick the potassium out, what do I absorb? If I reabsorb sodium and I reabsorb water, what automatically happens? I kick potassium out. ACTH can also cause an increase of aldosterone during stressful times. So this is kind of hard to see, but there are 3 ways that you can stimulate aldosterone. So first, decreased blood pressure. Second, increased blood potassium. Third, ACTH release due to stress. So all of these, if you have decreased blood pressure, we want to have increased. How do we do that? We reabsorb sodium and we reabsorb water. If I want to kick this potassium out, I reabsorb sodium, I reabsorb water. If I'm under a lot of stress, do I want to increase my blood pressure? Yes, because I want to run, right? I want my blood pumping. If I want to increase blood pressure, what happens if I reabsorb sodium and I reabsorb water? Well, guess what will happen? I'll increase my blood pressure. This right here, atrial natriuretic peptide, ANP, this comes from the heart. And this hormone will actually block aldosterone. So this is if your blood is too high and you want to bring it down. So if your blood pressure is too high and I want to decrease it, well, what happens if I get rid of sodium and I get rid of water? Well, my blood pressure will decrease. So what happens if you have hypersecretion? If you have too much aldosterone. If you have too much aldosterone, what's going to happen? If aldosterone is on, you're reabsorbing sodium and you're reabsorbing water and you don't stop. So that causes hypertension. If you increase your water, that increases your blood volume and that increases your blood pressure. But what if it's on overdrive? Well, now you're going to have hypertension. Your blood pressure is going to be too high. It causes edema. This is swelling. Well, gee, if you keep absorbing water, is that going to cause swelling? Yes. You'll also have excessive sodium. You'll also have excretion of potassium. Remember, if we're taking up sodium and we're taking up water, what's happening to my potassium? It's being released. Is that going to affect your neurons and your muscle resting membrane potential? Yes. The next group we're going to talk about is glucocorticoids. The main one that we're going to focus on is cortisol. So basically this hormone helps the body adapt to stress or intermittent food, so not having constant food supply. So it keeps your blood sugar levels constant, right? So keeping your glucose levels constant, and it helps maintain your blood pressure by increasing vasoconstrictors. So remember, if your blood vessels constrict, that can help increase blood pressure. We may or may not have talked about this, but if you dilate your blood vessels, you're going to have decreased blood pressure. So what do these glucocorticoids, specifically cortisol, how is it regulated? So it's released in response to ACTH. And remember, ACTH is released in response to CRH. And it's all based on cortisol levels in the blood. So what we're saying is the hypothalamus releases CRH, corticotropic releasing hormone. That causes the anterior pituitary to release ACTH. ACTH is going to go to the adrenal cortex, that's what we're talking about right now, and cause the adrenal cortex to release cortisol. So what controls cortisol release? It's not only ACTH, but they're saying it also has to do with low cortisol levels. So if your cortisol level is low, it's going to send a message back here, and you're going to kick out more CRH, more ACTH, and cause more cortisol. Cortisol's prime action is something called gluconeogenesis, formation of glucose from fats and proteins. So it's saying glucose that's new, and we're creating it. So you're not using carbs. So no carbs. It's easy to take carbs and break it down into glucose. We're saying take fats and proteins and turn them into glucose. It promotes a rise in blood glucose, fatty acids, and amino acids because you're breaking down fats and proteins. So what happens if you have hypersecretion of cortisol? So increased cortisol, it's something called Cushing's syndrome. Basically, you inhibit inflammation, you depress cartilage and bone formation, depress the immune system, and then we'll have changes in cardiovascular, neuro, and gastrointestinal function. So basically, if you're under stress all the time, you are constantly trying to make glucose available, you're using fats and proteins to do it, and you are suppressing the immune system. We do not have time to fight pathogens. We're worried about stress and food and survival. So sometimes people that are having immune system issues, they will put them on a steroid, right? You can't be on a steroid long term, but they'll cycle you on and off to try to depress your immune system. What happens if you don't have enough? So you have decreased cortisol. That's something called Addison's disease, and it also involves mineralocorticoids, which means you also have decreased aldosterone. So if you have decreased, that's what this one is, decreased cortisol, you're going to have decreased glucose and decreased sodium levels. The aldosterone is going to contribute to the decreased sodium levels. You're going to have severe dehydration because if you have low sodium, you're also going to have low water. And if you have low water, you're going to have low blood pressure. So this second bullet really is aldosterone. The top one is cortisol, except for the sodium here. That also is affected by aldosterone. So if you have Addison's disease, it could be to a deficiency in either one of these or both. Here's an example of a person that has Cushing's syndrome. So remember, Cushing's was increased cortisol. They usually develop this fat pocket. They call it the buffalo hump in your textbook, which is just awful, but it's basically a fat pad or fat pocket. And then if you notice, her face went from angular to a more rounded. So sometimes they say they have kind of a moon face. Here's our third group, gonadotropins. So these are the sex hormones. So estrogen, testosterone, and we're also going to think of, progesterone. These contribute to appearance of secondary sexual characteristic, onset of puberty. This would be like hair growth, right? In males, it could be voice changes, deepening of the voice. This could be breast growth in females. And what happens if you have hypersecretion of these gonadotropins? So the gonadotropins. Let's hope I spelled that right. So if you have increased secretion of testosterone, increase of estrogen, remember this is coming from the adrenal cortex. We're not talking about the ovaries and the testes. It's strictly adrenal cortex. Increased progesterone. If these hormones are high, it can cause masculinization. So if you're an adult male and all of a sudden you have high levels of testosterone, there's no real issue. But what happens if you're a young male? So say this is pre-puberty. If you're pre-puberty and all of a sudden your adrenal gland starts churning out tons of testosterone, guess what's going to happen? You're going to start developing those secondary sexual characteristics. What if you're a female And all of a sudden, you start creating lots of testosterone from your adrenal cortex. You could have beard development, masculine pattern body hair, and enlarged clitoris. We don't know this yet, but the penis and the clitoris are made up of the same tissue. So if testosterone is going to enlarge the penis, if you have too much in a female, it can cause the enlargement of the clitoris as well. Now we're looking at the adrenal medulla. So this is the inside, right, the middle of the adrenal gland. We're going to release epinephrine and norepinephrine. Again, we have two hormones here. That should give you a clue. We're going to have to know why. And they're under the category of catecholamines. So there are many catecholamines. The two that we're going to look at are epinephrine and norepinephrine. So sometimes people think of these two hormones as acting like adrenaline. They'll increase your blood glucose. They'll cause vasoconstriction, which will cause increased heart rate and increased blood pressure. Blood is going to be diverted to the important players, right? The brain, the heart, and the skeletal muscle. Remember, adrenaline, when you have your sympathetic nervous system, this is your fight or flight mode. And we learned that back in chapter 14 of 201. Both of these hormones exert the same effects, but some are more potent at different tasks. So if we're looking at epinephrine, it's going to stimulate metabolic activities. So epinephrine causes bronchial dilation. So again, if you're doing fight or flight, bronchial dilation is going to allow you to take up more oxygen, right? It's going to increase blood flow to the skeletal muscle and to the heart. Norepinephrine influences peripheral vasoconstriction and blood pressure. So your periphery, your arms and legs. What did we say we want to do? If we're trying to run away from the giant bear, we want to increase all of our blood flow to our brain and our heart and our skeletal muscles, right? With this slide, they want to show you short-term versus long-term. So this is what we just talked about. Adrenal medulla secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine. So if you're under stress, right, we can cause our sympathetic fibers to fire. They'll go to our adrenal medulla and they'll cause epinephrine and norepinephrine to be released. So short term, we have increased heart rate, increased blood pressure. We're going to take glycogen and we're going to turn it into glucose. We're going to dilate our bronchioles so that we can get more oxygen. Obviously, we're going to have more glucose so we can make more ATP, right? Changes in blood flow pattern and increased metabolic rate. Basically, speed everything up. But this is short term. Long-term stress, we talked about the adrenal cortex. So the hypothalamus is going to trigger the anterior pituitary to release ACTH. ACTH is going to go to the adrenal cortex and it's going to release our mineralocorticoids and our glucocorticoids. Remember, this one is aldosterone and this one is cortisol. And each of these are going to do long-term responses. So they're going to increase sodium and water by the kidneys, which is going to increase your blood volume and blood pressure. So remember, if your water goes up, that means your blood volume goes up, and if your blood volume goes up, that means your blood pressure goes up. What is cortisol going to do? It's going to break down fats and protein, use them as glucose so that we can make ATP. You're going to increase the amount of glucose in your bloodstream, and you're going to suppress your immune system. We're not worried about fighting infection if we're under lots of stress. We're just trying to survive. So you have two pathways here, whether you're under short-term stress or long-term stress, and all of them involve hormones. So what happens if you have hyposecretion? No real problems associated, because remember that the epinephrine and the norepinephrine was short-term. So let's say you're not releasing enough of this. Well, guess what? You still have that ACTH pathway, which was your long-term. What happens if you have hypersecretion? So you have elevated amounts of epi and norepinephrine. This leads to uncontrolled sympathetic nervous system response. This means hyperglucose in the blood, so too much glucose, make your blood thick, viscous. Increased metabolic rate, rapid heartbeat, palpitations, hypertension, that's increased blood pressure. Intense nervousness and sweating. Again, here's our summary chart. The category was mineralocorticoid. We're looking at aldosterone. You can look through what stimulates aldosterone to be released, right? If you have decreased blood volume, if you have elevated potassium levels and ACTH. What does aldosterone do? Where does it go? It goes to the kidneys and it increases blood levels in sodium and it decreases blood levels of potassium and it absorbs water, causes water absorption. So the target organ is the kidneys. It increases sodium level. It increases water level in the blood. And remember, it kicks out potassium when it does this. Then you have your glucocorticoids. The one that we're going to look at the most is cortisol, stimulated by ACTH. It goes to all body cells and it promotes gluconeogenesis and mobilizing fats for energy metabolism, right? We already talked about gluconeogenesis, turning carbohydrates, making carbohydrates from non-carbohydrate sources like fats. You remember gonatocorticoids. This is going to be your estrogens, testosterones, progesterones. This is stimulated by ACTH. What's going to happen in the males and females, something to do with libido and development of secondary sexual characteristics. Now we have our group of catecholamines, epinephrine and norepinephrine, stimulated by the sympathetic nervous system. It's going to target different organs, right? We're going to have increases target the heart. We're going to have increased metabolic rate. We're going to have increased blood pressure due to vasoconstriction. Next, we have the pineal or pineal gland. Remember, this is going to be on the posterior side, hanging from the third ventricle, if you remember that. You should go back and be familiar with your hypothalamus is here. Hanging off the hypothalamus is your pituitary gland. And then if you go towards the back area here, this is where your pineal gland is located. So your pineal gland is going to release melatonin. And melatonin has something to do with the timing of sexual maturity and puberty, your day and night cycles, your rhythm, right? Also has something to do with body temperature, sleep, and appetite. So this one's kind of hard for us to think about, but if you want to think about the stimulus, so what causes your pineal gland to release melatonin? The stimulus is your hypothalamus, and also they think darkness, if it's dark. Then this hypothalamus triggers your pineal gland to release melatonin. Then that melatonin cycles back to your hypothalamus and says, sleepy. We've talked about all of these glands. We're getting ready to talk about the pancreas, and then we'll briefly mention the ovary and the testes. But you should be able to tell me each hormone that's released from these glands. I'm not going to list them all here, right? Pituitary, what comes out of the post, what comes out of the anterior, list the 2, list the 6, parathyroid hormone, thyroid I missed, ooh, we should have 3 here, right? 3 hormones. The thymus we're not really going to talk about. Adrenal glands depends on if we're talking about the cortex or if we're talking about the medulla, right? So you should be able to name the 2 from the medulla, and you should be able to name the 5 from the cortex. Now we're going to move on to pancreas. So remember, the pancreas is behind the stomach or posterior to the stomach. It has both exocrine and endocrine functions. So right here, we're going to see that exocrine, these acinar cells that are going to produce juice for digestion. So enzyme rich, it's going to break down food. And then this part is the endocrine part. So we have something called the pancreatic isolate, and in it you have alpha cells and beta cells. What I usually do is when I look at this, I think A comes before B, so G comes before I. Sometimes we get these mixed up, so that's a nice way to look at it. So here is the pancreatic isolate. And inside there, you're going to have the darker cells, which are the alpha, which make the glucagon. And then you're going to have the lighter cells, which are beta cells, and they produce insulin. Out here, all of this is all the exocrine. These are all the acinar cells. These are going to release digestive enzymes. So here we have glucagon. Glucagon's job is to raise, or its function is to raise blood glucose levels. The target is the liver, where it promotes glycogenolysis, to take glycogen and break it down to glucose. We need the individual glucose in order to generate ATP. It also promotes gluconeogenesis, synthesizing glucose from lactic acid and non-carbohydrate sources. We've already seen this term before when we saw cortisol, right? And it causes the release of glucose in the blood. So insulin is the second hormone that's released from the pancreas, and it lowers blood glucose levels. What is it going to do? It's going to enhance membrane transport of glucose, basically tell the cell to take glucose in. So take the glucose from outside and bring it inside the cell. It's going to inhibit glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis. Both of these things raise blood glucose. We just saw that with glycogen. So we don't want that. We're trying to lower blood glucose. And you can see that insulin plays a role in neural development and learning and memory. Here's a great figure from your book. So here, your stimulus, your blood glucose level is high. If your blood glucose level is high, it causes your pancreas to release insulin. Insulin is going to tell your cells to take up glucose, and it's going to tell your liver to store glucose. So if your blood glucose level was high, if insulin is released and these two events occur, what's going to happen to your blood glucose? It's going to fall. Do we see how this is negative feedback? We're doing the opposite. It was elevated, now it's lowered. So what happens if your blood glucose falls too low? Your pancreas is going to release glucagon. You have low glucose. What can we do about it? Well, we can tell the liver to break down the glycogen into glucose. When the liver breaks down glycogen into glucose, guess what happens to your blood glucose level? It goes back up. So this is a balancing act between insulin and glucagon to make sure that you have the correct amount, or the normal amount, of blood glucose. So here's another clinical slide for you. What happens if you have diabetes? So type 1 diabetes or type 2, this has to do with hyposecretion of insulin. Usually type 1 is childhood. I'm being general here. Type 2 is usually onset adulthood, may have something to do with diet. So this just means your insulin is not working properly. So basically, if your insulin is low, what's going to happen? If you have low insulin, that also means you're going to have high glucose levels. Because what does insulin do? Insulin takes high glucose, and tells your cells to take in the glucose. Also tells your liver, store glucose. So if you have hyposecretion, your blood glucose levels are going to remain high. This can make you feel nauseated, lead to that sympathetic fight or flight response, and that just increases your blood glucose levels. So basically, you feel terrible, it leads to a sympathetic response, you're under a lot of stress, and then guess what? If you're under a lot of stress, we're going to help you release more glucose, and that's the problem. We already have too much. What happens to the excess glucose? It's going to be spilled into the urine. So one of the signs of having diabetes is that the urine will smell really sweet because lots of glucose is being spilled over into the urine. So remember, if your insulin is low, that means your blood glucose is high, right? Floating around in your bloodstream. If your blood glucose is high and your cells are not taking in glucose, your cells are starving, right? So your cells When sugars are not being used, your cells are going to try to take fat, and your body's going to try to break down fat so that your cells can have some energy. Basically, your cells are saying, we're in crisis. We don't have any food to make ATP, so your body's going to start trying to use fats. Well, guess what? When you start breaking down fats, it leads to high levels of fatty acids in the blood, and acids make your blood acidic, right? So they call it ketoacidosis. Basically, you're breaking down too many fats, you have lots of acids floating around in your bloodstream, and those acids are causing the pH of your blood to be off. This can cause a bunch of diseases or issues here, decreased heart rate activity or disrupted, issues with oxygen, issues with breathing, and depression of the nervous system. So here we can see the 3 cardinal signs of diabetes mellitus. I don't know if I said that earlier. You can say mellitus or mellitus. If you have polyuria, this is lots of urine output. So remember, you have all that excess glucose, right? That excess glucose is leaving in your urine, and you also have a lot of water leaving because you're constantly urinating. Polydipsia, this is excessive thirst. Well, if you have lots of water in your urine, your cells are going to need or want more water, and that's going to make you thirsty. And then polyphagia, excessive hunger. Remember, your cells are starving. They're not getting glucose. So basically, you think you're starving because the glucose can't get into the cells, not because you don't have enough glucose. And then sometimes you can have a hypersecretion of insulin. So if you have too much insulin, so increased insulin, that's going to cause a decrease in blood glucose. So they call that hypoglycemia. So not enough glucose circulating in your blood, which can cause disorientation and unconsciousness. So again, we don't want too much, we don't want too little, we want just right. So on to the gonads. Again, we're talking about the ovaries and the testes. The gonads produce the same sex hormones as those of the adrenal cortex, just in lesser amounts. So you have the ovaries, which produce estrogen and progesterone. These are responsible for the maturation of reproductive organs, secondary sexual characteristics. What I want you to realize is you have the adrenal cortex that's making these gonadotropins, right? So making these sex hormones. Eventually, these hormones are going to cause the reproductive organs to enlarge, and then eventually they're going to be making their own estrogen and progesterone. So you have 2 sources of steroid sex hormones, the adrenal cortex and your gonads, either ovaries or testes. Down here, human chorionic gonadotropin. This is a hormone that's secreted by the placenta. This is what you're measuring if you look at a pregnancy test. So the only way you make HCG is if you have created a placenta, and the only way you've created a placenta is if you're pregnant. So that's the hormone that we're measuring in pregnancy exams. Now, when we look at the testes, they're going to produce testosterone. This is going to help with male reproduction, maturation of male reproductive organs, male secondary sexual characteristics, necessary for sperm production, and help maintain the reproductive organs. Again, you still have your adrenal cortex, which is secreting testosterone, but you also will secrete testosterone by the testes once they're developed. With these last few slides, I just want you to realize that there are other hormone-producing structures. We're just focusing on the endocrine, but your adipose tissue releases a hormone called leptin, and they think it has something to do with appetite control. When we do blood, we'll look at the kidneys, and the kidneys release a hormone called EPO, or erythropoietin, and renin, and both of these have to do with blood pressure. So this has to do with creating red blood cells, and this actually is going to have to do with regulating blood pressure. Your skin releases hormones, that precursor to vitamin D. We already mentioned atrial natriuretic peptide from the heart, right, that reduces blood pressure. And then gastrointestinal tract, you actually have cells that are inside your stomach and your intestines, and they're going to release endocrine-like hormones like gastrin and ghrelin and secretin, and all of these are going to have something to do with regulating hydrochloric acid or stimulating the liver and the pancreas, which are going to help with digestion or stimulate food intake. So there's a lot more hormone producing structures than what we're talking about with the endocrine hormones. I wanted to talk about environmental pollutants. So basically just that exposure to chemicals, either industrial or pesticides, things in the soil and the water, can disrupt hormone function. So remember, if you have a cell and that cell has a receptor and that receptor allows for the binding of a hormone, what if some sort of chemical can displace the normal hormone and cause action to happen inside the cell even though no hormone was released? So some of these environmental pollutants can act as mimics. They can bind to receptors and they can cause cell action. So what happens as we age? Everything declines. So if you have declined growth hormone, declined muscle, declined thyroid, declined metabolic rate. Parathyroid levels are mostly constant, but estrogen can affect the parathyroid hormone and cause you to lose calcium in your bones. Ovaries undergo significant changes with age. They become unresponsive to gonadotropins. Eventually, females go through menopause, right? We'll talk about that with the reproductive chapter. Testosterone also declines with age, but it does not really doesn't really affect until very old age. So men will be producing sperm much longer than women will be producing eggs. Well, I hope you've enjoyed chapter 16. I know this one is really difficult. Please look at the hormone chart. Please fill it in. Please ask questions.